now making available famous bits of art to put behind you when you're doing Zoom calls.
We're on. Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to this Healthy Aging conversation. My name's David Brindle, and I'm going to be talking with Jeremy Hughes, the former Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Society, about dementia, dementia care and support, and the way forward for all those affected or involved. This is, by way of an introduction, a foreword, if you like, to a weekly series of webinars from Care Vision's Healthy Aging. The first, at this time next Tuesday, will be a conversation with two people living with the realities of dementia, Chris Roberts and his wife Jane Goodrick, who featured in a powerful BBC Panorama documentary back in 2016. And we'll be getting an update from them on their lives and their experiences. That one's not to be missed. But back to today, Jeremy Hughes led Alzheimer's Society for 10 years, during which time its profile and awareness of dementia more generally grew immeasurably. He remains vice chair of the World Dementia Council, which acts as a global advocate for the 50 million people thought to be living with the condition, of whom 850,000 are in the UK. That number is projected to rise to 1 million by 2025 and to 2 million by 2050. Already more than half of us know someone with a diagnosis of dementia. And it's estimated that 1 in every 3 babies born today will live to develop the condition in older age. So while our primary focus right now is understandably on coronavirus, the big long-term challenge for society remains dementia. Scientists believe they can develop a vaccine for COVID, possibly this year. But as we shall discuss, there's no such optimism about a breakthrough drug for dementia. Jeremy and I are going to be talking for 15, perhaps 20 minutes. Then we'll take some questions from you, and you can submit those questions in the comments section on your screen below. So, Jeremy, welcome, and back to the very beginning. Has dementia always been with us, or is it a blight of the modern age? And why is it becoming so prevalent?
So, David, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody today about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. It's really pertinent at the moment. I was talking to somebody this morning actually about the relationship with coronavirus, which is in everyone's mind, and how for some people the isolation of coronavirus has accentuated the impact of dementia on their lives. So we may come back to that later on. But to come back to your question, dementia isn't a disease. Dementia is a title for a collection of diseases that affect the brain and make your brain function less well than otherwise would be the case. The most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Around 2/3 of cases of dementia are Alzheimer's disease. And this was discovered by a German doctor, Dr. Alzheimer, in 1906, when he observed a patient of his who had abnormal behavior, memory loss, had language problems, and things that he couldn't quite identify. And unusually at the time, he did an autopsy after she died and examined her brain and discovered 2 things that were happening. There were changes which were clumps in the brain, lumps developing which are now known as amyloid plaques. And there were also tangled bundles of fiber, now known as tau. And those were the 2 fundamental things he found about Alzheimer's disease over 100 years ago. It's only one type of dementia, though. There are other types: vascular dementia, which is to do with blood supply, Lewy bodies dementia, frontotemporal lobe dementia, and a number of others. But Alzheimer's disease is the most common. What we're now finding increasingly with more knowledge is that people probably have what's called mixed dementia. There isn't simply one type. And indeed, I talked to one of the leading professors, Professor Carol Brain from Cambridge, a number of years ago. And she said, you know, probably in 10 years' time, we won't talk about Alzheimer's disease at all, because as we understand more about it, we'll realize it's not one disease, it's a number of different diseases that impact people in different ways. A bit like if you look at cancer, or even just take one type of cancer, breast cancer, there are now something like 50 different types of breast cancer, all of which have different treatments. So we have this general term Alzheimer's, this general term dementia, but they cover a whole number of different diseases. Now, although it was discovered in 1906 by Dr. Alzheimer, if you look back through history, it's quite interesting to see that now we know the symptoms of what shows that people have dementia. They've probably been around for a long time. And if you look in literature, famous example, I suppose, is King Lear in Shakespeare's play, where King Lear himself, people now think probably had dementia, although it wasn't recognized at the time. And right back, if you go to the Greek philosophers and the Roman classics from 2000 years ago, there are examples where in the writing you can identify people who probably had dementia. So it's probably always been with us. But the reason it's such a focus today, and as you say, David, so important to think about, is it's increasing. Now, it's increasing really for two reasons. One is a real reason, one is a sort of hidden reason. The real reason it's increasing is that the impact of dementia on your life increases the longer you live. So it may start developing, and we now think it's quite likely it starts developing in your 40s and 50s. But for most people, the symptoms don't become significant until your 60s or 70s. So as people live longer, more people are being impacted by dementia. Although some people, the impact can be much earlier. We know that there are at least 45,000 people who have dementia, quite severe dementia, before they're 65. But the other hidden reason is that we're just recognizing it more. We're now acknowledging something that was previously called senile dementia or just granny getting forgetful or confused. We're now recognizing it is a disease, and it's now being written on death certificates in the way it wasn't before. So probably a landmark point was when Margaret Thatcher died. She had dementia, and for one of the first times it was acknowledged in her death certificate that she actually died with dementia. So although it's been with us for a long time, we're now recognizing it more than ever before.
And is there something about modern life that makes us more vulnerable to it?
It's hard to say. I mean, the evidence is very scant, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk more about this, that there's nothing significant that we can say about the pressure of modern life that uniformly affects people, that increases the susceptibility to dementia. So I don't think it's modern living per se. There are a lot of theoretical ideas that get on the front page of the tabloid newspapers, which when I was at the Alzheimer's Society, we spent a lot of time rebutting. So I remember examples of the Daily Mail seemed to be one of the prime candidates, who would put a front page story saying if you ate broccoli twice a day, you wouldn't get dementia, or if you did something else, you would get it. And most cases, these were based on very small studies, often from a small university in America, maybe not even on people. There may have been studies on mice and they would draw this conclusion. So we don't really know enough to make any assumptions about lifestyle, modern living, although lifestyle issues do the way you live, but modern living particularly, I don't think is making it more of an issue today than it used to be.
And now, I said earlier that there was no prospect of a breakthrough, a miracle drug. Was that an unfair assessment of the situation?
Slightly unfair, but not very unfair. So we've had no new drugs for Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia for almost 15 years. The only drugs we have are what are called cholinesterase inhibitors, and they just reduce the symptoms. They don't stop the disease progressing. It steadily gets worse the longer you live with it. But these drugs do reduce the way it impacts on your day-to-day life, and they work for a certain length of time. They don't work forever for everybody. But as I say, for more than a decade, we've had no new drug developments. One of the issues that was highlighted when David Cameron hosted the G8 summit on dementia in 2013 was that we needed to get more drug development. And as Vice Chair of the World Dementia Council, we have one of our targets is a new drug therapy by 2025. Now, we're probably on track for that, but drug development takes a very, very long time. Typically for a drug company, it takes 30 years from the first research to the full drug being available to the public. So you can see how long it takes. And I think everyone's aware of that when we've talked about the speed at which you can produce vaccines, or rather can't produce vaccines for coronavirus. So even with the best will in the world, it takes a long time. So from standing start, it can take decades. But we are making some progress. So there's a new drug called aducanumab, which works tackling what I said earlier about the amyloid plaques in the brain. It tries to stop those developing. And aducanumab has now been is developed by a drug company called Biogen, and it's been applied for a license with the American regulatory authorities. Now, it may still not work, but the very important thing to remember is that even when we do get some new drugs, they will probably, each drug only work for a small minority of people with dementia. Go back to what I said earlier. Dementia and even Alzheimer's disease is not uniform. It affects different people in different ways, and a drug, a bit like a cancer drug, will work for a percentage of the population. So even if we get a new drug by 2025, it then needs to be licensed, it then needs to be properly tested, and then it will only work for a minority of people. So there's some reason to be cheerful and hopeful, but it's not a quick win by any means.
So in that context, Jeremy, should we be thinking more about non-drug therapies, and what are they?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, David. So although dementia gets worse the longer you live with it, and it's a progressive disease, what we do know is that you can change the speed at which it develops. You can improve your quality of life whilst living with dementia, and that's through what you described as non-drug therapies, interventions that will reduce the impact of dementia and may even prevent the speed of its progression. Now, there's been very little research on these new therapies, or non-drug therapies, even less than there has been on drug research. One of the first studies in the world was set up by the Finnish authorities, the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study, or FINGER for short. That's now being copied around the world. And that is for the first time over the last 6 or 7 years, showing that there is some way of developing non-drug therapies that work, but it's very early stages. What's interesting about Care Visions, who are putting on this conversation, is that they've been one of the organizations, probably the only organization in the world, not only to do research into non-drug therapies, but also to look at applying it in everyday life so that it brings it to people as quickly as possible. One of the frustrations is not only that there's only a limited amount of research, but often research gets stuck in the academic reports. It never reaches the public, and it takes a very long time. Care Visions, I find are quite good at both doing the research and then putting it into practice in real time.
So what do we mean when we talk about non-drug? Can you give us an example of a therapy
Yes.
that's efficacious?
Yes. So I think there's two things I would say. Firstly, some of the examples of non-drug therapy, and then the reason why they need to be put together. So examples are things like music, physical exercise, the ability to do brain stimulation through puzzles and games. There's probably about 18 different types of non-drug therapy that people can recognize and use. Art therapy, occupational therapy, aromatherapy, as well as I say, physical exercise, music, reminiscence. All these seem to have an effect, and all have been individually seen to have an effect. So they do exist. The important thing to remember is that on their own, they can just be stimulating activities. It's when you put them together in a scientifically evaluated program where you combine different therapies in a way that's mixed together, targeted for people in light of their own experience, that it begins to work most effectively. So different individual therapies, but non-drug as a group is even more effective over a sustained period of time.
And we're still at quite an early stage in putting that together in that way and having it assessed scientifically.
Yes, so I mentioned the FINGER study in Finland, which is ongoing. The Care Vision study that was published in the Journal of Dementia last November was the result of the work they did in China, where they developed a structured approach, what's a structured pathway, putting these things together and testing them out over several years, because it's not a quick fix. Something called cognitive stimulation therapy is another way it's being put together, but often those are for very short-term interventions, and the evidence is not that strong that just doing a program for a few weeks makes the big difference. So what's interesting about the Care Visions research in China is it was over a couple of years, and it was looking at the impact on the development of someone's dementia over the long term by a combination of non-drug therapies coming together in one program.
And you were talking earlier about the ambition of having a drug, an effective drug by 2025. The potential then is perhaps for a non-drug therapy structured in this way to be available quicker than that.
Yes, and we've already seen some of the impacts and some of the benefits in the programs that have already been running. Some of the Care Vision's videos that have put these elements together that are available on YouTube, some of the programs that individual charities are doing, like the Alzheimer Society with Singing for the Brain and other activities. We can see immediately the benefit and the value of these interventions. So unlike drugs where you just have to wait for the long term, you have to do all the trials and testing, and then eventually the drug appears and your doctor prescribes it. We can start implementing non-drug interventions right now because there are no damaging side effects. So we may not have all the evidence to show it works as perfectly as it will as we increase the research, but we know it does good anyway, and we can get on with it now.
Right. By definition, I suppose, non-drug implies effective engagement with the individual living with dementia and their caregivers. Has there been a deficit in the past in terms of that sort of engagement, that sort of empowerment of the, if you like, consumer?
Yes, I think it has been, and I think there still is a deficit, if I'm honest, David. If you look across health and social care, and I've spent all my life working in health and social care, initially we had a program of doing good to people, not with people. It was very patronizing. I remember when I started working at the Leonard Cheshire organization, 20 years ago, it was all about helping disabled people because they couldn't help themselves. Yes. We've come a long way and we've changed the outlook, and we're now saying that people with the best knowledge and the best experience are people who are living day by day, both as people with dementia and as family caregivers. But historically, they haven't been involved in research as much as they should, and they haven't been involved in the decision making around their care programs. If you go as a person, and I know from my own family experience with my mother-in-law, the diagnosis process is done to you, not done with you. It's still a test that's supplied by a doctor, often in an alien environment of a memory clinic, and you don't really feel that you're in control. And it is a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach. As I said earlier, different people respond to dementia in different ways. If you involve people in designing their own therapeutic programs, if you actually let them tell you about what makes a difference, then you can customize the program. So that co-production is absolutely vital, and I think something that people now recognize needs to happen more and more.
And wider societal attitudes, is there still work to be done on that?
Yes, I think we need to change the way people see dementia. It's changed a lot. I mean, one thing that I'm most proud of in the last 10 years at Alzheimer Society is starting that change. So the Dementia Friends program, and I've got the badge on myself, the Dementia Friends is a program which increases basic level of awareness amongst the British public, and now in 48 other countries around the world. We've now got 3 million people who've become Dementia Friends in the UK. And that's making an enormous difference, because it means for someone with dementia and their family caregiver, they feel it's okay to go out of the house. And if they do something that's unusual, if they can't deal with money in the supermarket, if they get confused, if they get a bit aggressive because of that's the way dementia affects them, they can be confident now that with so many people having become a dementia friend, with 1 in 20 of the population having become a dementia friend, there'll be probably someone who says, hang on a minute, that disruptive behavior isn't because they're a disruptive person, it's a disease that's affecting their brain. The fact that they're holding me up in the queue at the supermarket isn't their fault. Now, if we can change social attitudes and make people more supportive for including people with dementia in the community, it enables them to live better, particularly takes the pressure off the family caregiver. And one of the things that distresses me is how often people with dementia end up going into care homes, not because the disease has progressed to a point that they need to go into the care home, but the isolated family member who looks after them has just collapsed under the pressure of it all being on them and feeling that society isn't supportive. So if we can change the society's attitudes, then I think we're on a good path to making everyone live better with dementia, alongside, as I say, the increased use of non-drug therapies on an individualized basis.
Now, you mentioned the COVID crisis earlier. Has that impeded the momentum that you were talking about there with developing awareness of dementia and people living with it, or are there reasons which we can perhaps draw optimism from this situation we're in at the moment?
Well, in the short term, I think it's been enormously challenging. People with dementia benefit from social inclusion, as I say, by society welcoming them. The stimulation of engagement can be one of the things that staves off the progressive development of dementia. That's why some of the non-drug therapies are all about stimulating activity, joining in singing in choirs or taking part in physical exercise programs. So in the short term, there's been a real damaging experience for people who've become very isolated through shutdown, have often been in their own rooms, in their own homes, been very afraid to engage at all. So that's the short-term difficulty. However, I think there are some reasons to feel positive. The first one is that we now realise that social care is important. Because, as we've talked about today, there is no drug that treats dementia. It's unusual as a disease, and it is a disease the same as cancer or heart disease or diabetes. It's a disease, but it's not treated on the NHS. People don't get the support they need. They have to pay for their own care unless they have almost no money. There are, as I say, lack of resources going into supporting people with dementia. So I think there's been a public attitude change as a result of coronavirus, which means people now realise that social care is important. The second thing that I think has made a big difference is recognising that you can do a lot at a distance. You can do online support. You can produce videos in the way that Care Visions have that enable support to be brought into people's own homes. If we go back to what I said about getting a diagnosis of dementia, it's very disruptive to have to go to a memory clinic or go to the doctor every time you want to talk about your dementia. If we can get more online support, if we can get a return, and it's a bit like going back to the old days of Dr. Finley's casebook, you can go back to home visits where doctors come and visit people at home rather than expecting you to go to the surgery. That may be a positive outcome of coronavirus. You get more customised, personalised care and support, and that will make all the difference for people with dementia.
And there's obviously more awareness at the moment of the science and health interface. Is that going to help us advance the search for an effective drug?
Yes, I think my optimism tells me that should be the case. You used to be able to switch off the news when they had the occasional item on the 10 o'clock news talking about science, and you could sort of mentally switch off. Well, nobody's been able to do that for the last 3 months because the entire news has been about science. So I think the public generally are more aware of science, they're more aware of research, they're more aware of the need to invest in good health, both individually and as a society. We found, for example, around the research for a vaccine for coronavirus, that we can speed up research. One of the first stages when you're developing a research trial is getting what's called ethics approval, which means you get approval to go ahead, that you're not going to do any harm and the authorities think it's good. Well, traditionally, that can take 6 or 9 months. Now, with coronavirus, people have been able to do it in 6 to 9 days, not 6 to 9 months. So if we can speed up research and if we can produce more focus on the investment needed, then our job, I think, is to make sure that people apply that to dementia. And dementia is the global pandemic that's hidden. I mean, in long-term effect, as you mentioned at the beginning, David, we're going to have 2 million people in the UK living with dementia by 2051. 1 in 3 people born today will end up with dementia. So it is a global pandemic and a national pandemic. And we need to recognise that and make sure that the resources go in now for the research that's needed.
So taking a glass half full approach to that, let's think about 2050. What would be a good place to be, irrespective of a drug breakthrough?
Well, I think it comes back to what we've been saying in this conversation. What would be a good place to be by 2050 is to make sure that non-drug therapies, non-drug interventions are available to everybody in a customized way, in a way that means they can give details of what works for them. So some people are stimulated more by music, some people are stimulated more by reminiscence, some people are stimulated more by art, etc. If you can develop a joined up, customized non-drug therapy program for each individual with dementia, then you're onto a positive outcome, because whether there's a drug or not, people will be able to live better with the disease. To me, the ambition is not that we'll get rid of dementia. We won't get rid of dementia, But if we can get rid of the damage it does to people's everyday lives, if we can make it something you can live with, whether it's by a drug intervention or a non-drug intervention or a combination of both, then I think we're on a successful path. That would make such a difference. One of the things that, well, the three things that I think people feel are damaging about dementia is a lack of hope and fear and shame that goes, and guilt probably. So fear, shame and guilt are the three things that get in the way. If we can get rid of those and make people understand that it's a disease, it's not your fault, that something can be done about it, even today, through non-drug interventions and through the research program going forward, I think we, by 2025, have reason to be positive and optimistic.
Thanks, Jeremy. We have a question in from actually on the drug research issue, and it's from Jessica Morris from Brixton in South London. And Jessica says she was wondering how research into dementia treatment or therapy compares with other medical conditions. She feels she hears a lot about cancer research and less so about dementia. Is that's a fair observation?
I think that's probably exactly right. And thank you, Jessica, for that question. So there was a study last year published in the United States looking at how many drug trials there are in the world into dementia, and they came up with 132. But of those drug trials, only 28 were in what's called phase 3, which is as you get from the lab science to testing on patients with a hope to it actually becoming a treatment. Now that sounds a lot, but actually it's tiny compared to cancer. If you look at the percentage of money spent on cancer research in the economy, we spend in the British government investment in cancer research is about £260 million a year. That's the government money, and then there's the charity money alongside that. Government money into dementia research is about 80 million. So it's far less than cancer. And yet the cost to the economy, the cost to society of dementia is greater than the cost of cancer and heart disease put together. So we have, if you look at the numbers of scientists, we have about 1/6 number of scientists working on dementia as we have working on cancer. So not surprisingly, we don't know as much. Fewer people doing less research means it's much slower to develop. So we really do need a push. And there was a petition, actually almost, I was thinking about it the other day, about exactly a year ago, there was a petition that Alzheimer's Research UK presented to number 10 Downing Street, saying that we should spend 1% of the cost of dementia on research. That would still be less as a percentage than is spent on cancer research, but it would be 3 times as much as the government currently commit to. And I think we need to see that happening.
And within the money that is spent on dementia research, what is the breakdown between research into a pharma solution and research into non-drugs? Zara Quayle is asking this question.
Well, no, that's a really good question as well. So it's a tiny amount. I haven't got the exact figures in my head, but if you think back to Dr. Alzheimer in 1906, since then, there have been people trying to research drug interventions, trying to find out a way of treating people with dementia. As I say, the last result was these drugs that reduce the impact, that they were more than 10 years ago. But there's been, over 100 years of some investment into drug therapy. The only investment into non-drug therapies has been really in the last decade. As I mentioned, the finger study, there's some research going into UK universities. There's the study that Care Visions did based on their research in China. But it's a tiny proportion, which almost seems to be the opposite, because what we're saying is that even after 2025, even if we get a drug in 2025, it will only work for a small number of people. So the non-drug treatment needs more evidence. And until we get the research programs ramped up, we won't get that evidence and we won't get it developed in the way it should. So it's a tiny proportion, and it should probably be totally turned around and much more money go into the non-drug research than currently is the case.
And our final question here from Robert Knight from Wigan. And Robert's saying, very interesting to hear what you're saying. Robert has a family member recently diagnosed. Still early days, he says, but could you explain a little bit about how dementia changes over time, and does it always necessarily get worse?
So I think the reality is it does get worse over time. I can't deny that. It steadily gets worse, but the speed at which it gets worse will vary depending on the therapeutic environment and the support that you get. So you can slow down, you can prevent the progression of the disease by the non-drug therapies we talked about, and ultimately maybe by drugs themselves. But different parts of the brain work in different ways. So one of the things we tell people in the Dementia Friends program, and if anyone watching isn't a dementia friend, I urge them to become one because it gives you some base understanding, is that there are two bits of the brain that behave very differently with dementia, the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the factual part of your brain, the bit that you remember dates and facts, and that tends to go more quickly. The emotional part of your brain is called the amygdala, and that lasts a lot longer. So one important thing to remember is even as dementia progresses, even if your loved one can't remember who they are, they can still respond emotionally because they know you're a caring person. They may forget you're their daughter or their son or their spouse, but they know the warmth of emotional support and the warmth of comfort that they get from people caring about them. So it does get worse, but there are things that can be done, and different parts of the brain work at different speeds in the way that the disease affects you.
And in that context, I remember Chris Roberts in that Panorama documentary saying, "I still live, I still have a life. It's just a different quality," which I think is very, very pertinent. Jeremy, I've learnt a lot. I hope our viewers have too. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us. A reminder that next Tuesday here at 4 p.m. We'll be joined by Chris Roberts, who, as I say, lives with dementia, and his wife, Jane Goodrick, who cares not only for him, but additionally for her mother, who also has a diagnosis of dementia, as well as, in fact, of cancer. Chris and Jane are both Dementia Friends, champions, and they're ambassadors for Alzheimer's Society. So join us here to hear much more next Tuesday, the 16th of June at 4 p.m. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you, David.